Okay, so Johnson gets what he wanted. He gets a total surprise. Neither Grant or Sherman had any idea that Johnson, their intelligence was really shoddy. That they had no idea that there was a significant Confederate army that had just gathered in Corinth. Um, Grant actually thought the Civil War was almost over. He thought that basically what was going to happen at that point was just a mop-up operation. So, Grant thinks the war's basically has come to an end, especially in the West. Now, you did have some Union skirmishers, these soldiers that had gone out, looking for looking for trouble, and they did come back and they told Sherman, whose men were in the position closest to Albert Sidney Johnson, hey, we think there's something going on with Confederate troops. We're hearing stuff and we're sensing stuff. And what happened is that Sherman kind of laughed at them. He said, "Oh, you guys are acting just like I acted. You're panicking." And so what happened is that when the attack happened, uh, the Confederates just burst upon the Union lines, and it was a complete shock to Union soldiers. Union soldiers were cooking their breakfast. They were literally cooking their breakfast. And very, very quickly, when the Confederates moved in, they were able to capture the front lines of the Union troops. And but what happened, and this is what often happened early in the Civil War, the Confederates were just as disorganized by their victory as the Union was. Union soldiers were by their defeat. So one very, very famous story that happened is Confederate soldiers that were really hungry. There weren't really very good supplies and logistics in the Confederate Army at this point. As they launched the surprise attack against these Union soldiers, and the Union soldiers either were captured or ran towards the rear, the Confederate soldiers actually stopped and started eating their breakfast, the breakfast that the Union soldiers were fixing. And also Confederate soldiers would go into their tents looking for shoes, that kind of a thing. So initially, the Confederate thrust, it was very powerful, and it was rolling over the Union lines, but it was a little bit retarded in a way, or stalled, as Confederate soldiers who, it wasn't a lack of courage, they just weren't, they were hungry, they weren't that disciplined. A fair amount of Confederate soldiers kind of just stop, at least for a little bit, eat breakfast, get some shoes before moving on. So initially, it looks like it's going to be a rout. Initially, it looks like Johnson's going to get the annihilation of Grant's army that he had hoped for, that he'd planned for. Now, Grant didn't even know about the attack. He was on a steamship a little bit upriver of the Tennessee River. He was waiting for Buell to come, and he was kind of looking for him. And so Grant's not even on the scene when the battle breaks out. And the wind was kind of funny, and you often hear about this during the Civil War. The wind could obscure the sounds of battle, depending on the way it was blowing. But by the afternoon, the late morning, early afternoon, Grant hears about the attack, and he comes to the position, and he orders Union soldiers to not retreat anymore. Some of the Union soldiers find a sunken road, and they're able to go there and establish a pretty good defensive line. And once Grant gets there, he manages to establish some order to the Union troops. Same with Sherman. Sherman had about 4 horses shot out from under him at the Battle of Shiloh, but he kept his cool. He organized his men after their initial shock. He managed to create defensive lines to kind of slow down the Confederate attack. And Sherman himself later said that he gained the necessary confidence that he needed as a leader at Shiloh. That he found himself in a sense because he fought very, very effectively at Shiloh. So what happens is that Grant shows up, and Grant does what Grant does best. He'd been surprised. He had not really positioned his men in a way that, where they'd thrown up defenses. He had not done a good job in that sense. He'd never make that mistake again. But once he arrives at the battlefield, and you have to remember, things looks like they're going to complete hell. It looks like the Union troops are about to annihilate his army. Pittsburgh Landing was kind of interesting. There was about a 50-foot bluff between the river and the position where Union soldiers were, and it looked like the Union soldiers were just going to be thrown off their position down into the Tennessee River. But Grant gets there. He keeps his calm. He manages to deploy Union troops in such a way that it manages to stop the thrust of the Confederate attack. One of the things Grant does is he orders the Union gunships to start lobbing artillery shells into the Confederate forces, which helps as well. And so what we see here is, on one hand, Grant's inexperience showed because of his lack of preparation, but we see that during battles, Grant's absolute genius at keeping calm. This was Grant's great gift, and McClellan did not have this. McClellan would have completely freaked out. But Grant gets there, he knows he's been surprised, but he goes to work trying to fix things. And he deploys his troops, he calls in the Navy. There's a very famous scene. General Buell finally gets to the Pittsburgh Landing the first day of the battle. And he sails up a little bit ahead of his troops. And, thousands of Union troops had actually stopped fighting, and they had gone to the bluffs, and they had gone down towards the river, and they were protecting themselves from Confederate fire. They had just kind of given up on the fight. And Buell said to Grant, you should shoot these guys for desertion. And Grant said, I'll just forget about that. And Grant wrote in his memoirs, look, these men were just inexperienced. I really couldn't blame them for what they were doing, and many of them fought very, very well for the rest of the war. But this is the kind of thing that Grant could do. He could figure out what was going on in a battle. He could kind of separate the wheat from the chaff, what was unimportant, what was important. He just kind of had that gift in this very chaotic situation to make sense of what needed to be done, and then implement what needed to be done, and kind of give his men some courage, and not kind of in a bombastic way, but kind of in a very low-key way, but also a very competent way as well. And so that's what Grant does. That night, Sherman came upon Grant, and again, Grant had managed to stop the thrust of the Confederates, and Sherman. It was raining that night, and again, Grant had been able to establish a very, very good defensive position, so that the immediate crisis had passed. Something else that had happened on the first day of the battle: Albert Sidney Johnston was killed. He was shot just above the boot line, and his doctor couldn't figure out where the wound was, so Johnston kind of, sadly for Johnston, bled to death. And so that is never good when your commanding officer is killed at the day of battle. So at the end of the first day of battle, Grant has kind of come and kind of cooled out the situation. He's established defensive lines. And Sherman walks up to him, and Sherman's going to suggest to Grant that perhaps the Union Army should just retreat upriver, and then come back another day. And Sherman wrote in his memoirs that he took one look at Grant, and something told him not to say anything to Grant about retreating. And Sherman said to Grant, boy, we've had a tough day. And Grant looked at him and he said, "Yeah, we'll get him tomorrow. We'll get him tomorrow," which is classic Grant. Grant's not thinking about how bad things were gone. Grant's thinking about how he can fix it. Can you tell I admire Grant? I'm a big fan of Grant. So that's what Grant does. The next day, Grant's army goes and recovers all the ground that it had lost on the first day of the Battle of Shiloh. And then at that point, both armies just kind of stop in exhaustion.